Welcome to Lesson Learned, the official podcast of the Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment Department at Midwestern Intermediate Unit 4. I'm your host, Shannon Smith, and today we're diving into breaking the cycle, revisiting bullying prevention. So welcome back to our series on school climate, as we continue to take a deeper look into the heart of school culture, climate, and connection. So we're not only revisiting, we're unpacking an issue that's often discussed but not always fully understood: bullying. It's more than isolated incidents. It's a part of a larger pattern that impacts student well-being, safety, and learning outcomes. In this episode, we'll explore recent trends identified in the PAYS data. For anyone unfamiliar with this document, that's the Pennsylvania Youth Survey, and asking some big questions, such as what are the root causes of bullying? What trends are we seeing in our schools? And most importantly, how do we break the cycle? Joining me once again in this studio are our two incredible experts, Dr. Melissa Nelson, a K-12 school safety and security specialist, and Dr. Susan Tarasevich, a specialist in student assistance programs, school climate, and published author. Together, we'll explore not just the data, but the real-world implications for prevention, intervention in creating environments where every student feels seen, supported, and safe. So grab your coffee and let's lean into this important conversation. Melissa and Susan, thank you for being here with me again today.
It's a pleasure to be back with you again, Shannon.
Always.
So again, how does your level of expertise lead in to bullying prevention?
Well, the lens that I'm bringing to this conversation is having served in schools in multiple settings, as from paraprofessional to teacher to administrator, and now as I work across the state with school leaders, school educators, and hearing about what the issues are that are coming up around bullying and outcomes of bullying, and also, and especially through the lens of thinking about how bullying plays into potential for targeted violence in schools and for thoughts and acts of suicide with students and our children and adolescents.
And I guess my work over the last few decades has been to help schools really build sustainable frameworks for responding to behavioral health issues. And that runs the gamut. And bullying is really at the core of so many mental health crises that can emerge, because it takes such a profound psychological toll. You know, we think it's just on the victims, or the targets, but it's also perpetrators and bystanders as well.
So bullying is not a new topic of conversation for us, but why is now a critical time to take another look at bullying prevention in schools?
Well, I think that yesterday, today, and tomorrow are always critical times to revisit or visit maybe for the first time bullying prevention in schools. As Susan mentioned, the effects of bullying run the whole gamut of who they affect, from not just the victim, but also the bystander and the person engaging in bullying behavior. Another reason why it's critical is we know more about what the outcomes of bullying are, especially around correlations and causations of being a victim of bullying, and what that may potentially mean as far as thinking about targeted violence and suicide.
So based on the PAYS data, which, as we've said in previous episodes, contains a wealth of data, what trends about bullying behaviors really stand out to you, particularly when it comes to where it's happening, how often, and who's involved?
Well, first, I think when we talk about the PAYS survey in bullying, it's very important to establish for any educator or any family member of a child or adolescent who's listening to this, if you haven't seen the PAYS before, in the PAYS, before students start asking any of the questions that pertain to bullying, that they are reminded of the definition of bullying. They're told what it is, and they are given examples of what it is not. Because often when I'm out working with educators in the field, something that they might say is, well, a lot of people think that everything is bullying now. So how are we sure they understand how, what they're thinking about when they answer these questions? So if you were to go to the PAYS site, PAYS 2023, you could look there and you can actually see the list of questions that are asked, and you can also see that the definition is given for what bullying is and what it is not. So that's something to understand very importantly. So then next, when we look at that data, what we start to see is that questions are being asked of students of where this is happening, why it's happening to them, and what we start to notice is that students who said they've been bullied in the past 12 months are saying, first and foremost, it happens in the school setting. Now, that's not surprising because that's where students spend the majority of their time with other students. That's where they are most of the time. So that's where it's happening. It's happening on social media. That's certainly a very prevalent place. But the reasons why the top reasons why they're stating that they're being bullied is because of things like the way they look, their height, their weight, and sometimes they simply answer the question by saying it's some other reason that isn't being listed. So we start to have a better understanding of specifically what's showing up in their life as far as bullying.
Now, are we noticing any trends in terms of the reasoning why bullying is happening in our schools?
Well, first of all, I think we have to go back to understanding that the digital landscape has really changed dramatically. And kids are more influenced now by social media and online platforms, and that really has transformed cyberbullying. It makes it more complex and much more far-reaching. And I think when you look at the root causes of bullying, you have to really see that much of it comes from mental health issues, a desire for attention. There can be, a profound lack of empathy. I have been following self-reported empathy scores among college freshmen. And self-reported empathy scores over the last 10 years have gone down over 10 points. So somehow that lack of empathy is at its core a real significant challenge.
So, other than the obvious glaring instances of bullying that we may come across, what are some of those subtle early warning signs of bullying that staff might miss, either in engaging with the data or just walking through the hallways?
I think from my work in student assistance, one of the things that we're seeing is when you see students who are having difficulty getting to school when their parents, and this we've seen in elementary, parents are reporting that they can't get them on the bus, that they're anxious and they're crying. So that's one factor. I think another factor that we sometimes miss is kids don't want to go to the cafeteria and have lunch, so they'll sit in front of their locker. Remember that bullying occurs most often in the unowned spaces in schools, in places where there are no adults. So if we see kids avoiding certain activities, certain peer groups, that's another one. I think the other thing that we've been seeing is higher rates of anxiety and depression that are getting in the way of what had been a student who was achieving academically on grade level now starts to slip. So, those are three that we're seeing most often.
We had talked about the importance of rapport and building connections with our students. So, how can feeling connected at school, building good relationships with our adults, and feeling safe affect whether bullying trends go up or down?
Well, I think one of the most direct connections to whether students feel safe in school and whether they have good, healthy connections with adults in schools gets to then whether bullying is being reported or not. What we know is that when students feel safe enough and secure enough to go and talk to an adult that they know will listen to them and then engage in an action of follow through, then they're more likely to go and report that. So that's one way. It's also wonderful that in Pennsylvania we have the ability to report bullying anonymously. Many districts set up anonymous reporting systems. There are some districts that I've worked in that have places like boxes outside of a counselor's office in an elementary where a student can fill out a slip and write an anonymous concern. We can use Safe to Say in Pennsylvania. Anyone can report things like concerns about bullying, about mental health concerns, about suicidality, about potential targeted violence through Safe to Say. So I think, when students feel good about the connections they have, when there are adults in schools who listen to children, and especially, and I can't emphasize this enough, that then follow through and make sure within the realms of what we can share about what we're doing, within the context of what the law says we can share and what we can't, if there's some sort of disciplinary action because of bullying, then that's the most direct effect on bullying, is that it gets reported more often so that we can do more about it.
Susan, you have already touched base on the influence of social media in our current culture. But how might things that are occurring in the wider community, perhaps stress within the internal family or bias, impact bullying in schools?
Shannon, that's really a loaded question. I do think that, more than ever before, we're faced now with trying to understand how bias can play into this. Very often, we have biases because we learn them either from home or we see it in media or peer groups. Sometimes bias is there because we don't trust. We see somebody else as different than us, and that takes away from us. I think that it's also possible that, sometimes the kids who bully have underlying insecurities and they use bullying to boost their own self-worth or deflect attention from their own vulnerabilities. Sometimes they have been bullied themselves. It's a way that they also can manage their own anger and frustration or other strong emotions. But these days, I think, cultural norms are shifting, and we have some cultural norms now that really glorify aggression and dominance, and that can contribute to bullying behaviors. I think bullying rooted in prejudice against individuals based on race, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, is driven by intolerance. It doesn't mean that I have to accept, but how can I respect who a person is for who they are? And we don't have an easy time teaching that these days.
So for many teachers and school safety teams, what might prompt us to turn a blind eye to bullying and actually step in and acknowledge when bullying is happening?
As Susan mentioned, so often students are savvy enough to engage in bullying in spaces that are unowned, or even in spaces like a classroom when a teacher turns their back. Mm-hmm. And bullying can be incredibly complex. There is a lot of work that has to be done when a report of bullying comes in to understand the entirety of the picture, to really understand, well, where can we best provide support. So I think of it less of turning a blind eye to it and more of a, how do we set up structures, how do we set up reporting, the ability to report bullying, and in a way that allows us to provide the appropriate supports where we need to be providing them.
And I think in our conversations, we've highlighted the importance of prevention over reaction. So in terms of bullying, are we reacting to safety issues, or are we actually being proactive? And how do we change that?
So anytime we address bullying, rarely is that just the only thing that we're addressing. There's a reason why a child is engaging in bullying behavior. There's some power they're trying to gain, some power they're trying to wield. And so when we address the bullying behavior, not only are we addressing that behavior, but we should really be trying to address the why behind that behavior. That's a question that I ask myself often and ask other educators. But why is this student engaging in bullying behavior? And then when we look at a victim or a bystander and we address the bullying behavior at face, then we're also addressing, how are they doing? Are we addressing any fallout that might come from the bullying? So I think there are times when we can be preventative, when we have good Tier 1 bullying prevention programs, when we have good reporting systems, when we have good positive connections with students in school. And then there are some times, because bullying happens even in the context of all of those proactive measures, we still do have to be reactive sometimes.
I just want to pick up on the proactive universal strategies. Again, as Melissa said, having those clear and consistent policies. Some educators say to me, well, I don't report it anymore because it comes back unfounded, that it was just kids being mean to each other. It really wasn't bullying, but nothing ever gets done. And so I think, in terms of policy, while we do have to delineate and distinguish between mean behavior and bullying behavior, which goes to that power imbalance, I think we also have to recognize that we still need to follow through and get back to people and report consequences and make sure that there are consequences for even just mean girls, right? Being mean to each other. I really like weaving bully prevention right now into positive behavior interventions and support, or MTSS. It's a way that we proactively teach and reinforce those positive behaviors. It can reduce opportunities for bullying, but we also need to train kids on what to do if they feel like they're being bullied. I like Rob Horner's Stop, Walk, and Tell. Very easy to remember. You can teach it K-12. Embed it again in that MTSS framework. I also think we have to do more bystander intervention training, empowering our students and staff to really safely intervene when they witness something, teaching them to step up rather than stand by.
Susan, you hit on a few things that I was questioning, whether it was unfounded feedback in instances where bullying had been reported. Are we sometimes missing bullying because we're simply attributing it to, typical teen conflict or drama within a group of friends, maybe just typical teen behavior? And what's the risk of doing that?
The risk is people stop reporting. I think the risk is always that we weaken the perception that our systems don't work for some kids. And we really want to be as consistent as we possibly can. I think administrators, when they do their, you become aware, you investigate, a lot of times they get information that might not be accurate, or they don't ask enough questions, or the data is insufficient. So I think that really going back to, that data gathering piece is really essential. There's not one administrator that I've ever talked to that didn't do something, regardless of whether it was bullying or not. I think we need to reboot our understanding of bullying again and come back and show people, here's what the PACE survey is telling us. 25% of seniors who took the 2023 survey said they'd been bullied in the last, 12 months. That's still a quarter of our kids, and I think it's probably underreported because not every child in Pennsylvania takes that survey.
Well, is we're placing an emphasis on prevention over reaction so that we can try and stop some of these instances from occurring. What does effective prevention really look like, both in the classroom and for overall campus safety?
I think good prevention really is solid social and emotional learning that's woven into our daily curriculum. I think every opportunity we can get to teach empathy, to teach emotional regulation, to teach skills in conflict resolution and responsible decision making as part of our curriculum, not as a standout pullout. I think so much of the prevention work, whether it's for substance use or whatever, bullying, is done by experts who come in and work with kids for 8 to 10 weeks, once a week, and we did our prevention. That kind of thing does not, even though it was intended to build capacity, it doesn't seem like it really is. So, I think the more that an organization, a school, can invest in good social and emotional learning, evidence-based programs, the more they're going to be able to address bullying, not just preventatively, but also reduce the number of reactive discipline practices that occur.
And when we think back to our first two podcasts when we were talking about climate and culture, and I think about prevention, bullying prevention just has to be the fabric of what our culture is about, which is we embrace and celebrate differences with each other. And even if you personally don't want to embrace someone's difference, or you aren't on the same page with someone's difference, then you live and you let live. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the culture, so that everyone feels in that climate that they belong. So really the best prevention starts with just making sure it's interwoven into the very fabric of what is our expectations in the school, which is everyone belongs. No matter who they are, they belong. And when that message is being sent by adults to children, then children embrace that same thing. And that's one of the greatest tools of prevention that we have, is we embrace and we celebrate the differences of each other. Mm-hmm.
So how can teachers and security teams work together better, and not just responding to trauma and crisis situations, but to really build a prevention-based positive school culture from the start?
I think back to the time that I spent within the districts where I worked, and how many places there were opportunities for everyone, not just teachers, not just people who might be on the school-based security law enforcement teams, engaging in creating positive school culture, but just really sending that message that every adult in the building, every child in the building, community members, families are really part of positive school culture. And so we want to make sure that they're all on the same page as that. We want to make sure that the classroom lessons that our school counselors, that school social workers, that school psychologists, that school nurses teach are used as a foundation for teachers, for paraprofessionals, for secretaries, for cafeteria workers, for coaches to build on. And so really we want to think about the foundational things that we're doing, and then have everyone working together, moving in the same direction, to make sure that there's a positive school climate, and that the culture supports and expects that we are embracing of everyone, and that we report and allow adults to help the children and adolescents when that isn't happening.
And I go back to when I'm such a big fan of multi-tiered systems of support, and having small groups at tier 2 that focus on skill development, assertiveness, anger management. Do we have mentoring programs? Are we pairing our students with those trusted adults? Do we have check-in, check-out systems? Do we have conflict resolution? Do we have mediation available? I go back to, if they didn't get it in the tier 1 SEL lessons, we're going to have more interactive lessons that are relevant to kids' specific needs. I think increasing adult supervision in the hallways, in the cafeteria, stairwells, strategically increasing adult presence. And I think saying to staff, that's why I need you in that hallway. And really being attentive and seeing that as a time for connection. I think at Tier 3, to address students who are persistently exhibiting bullying behaviors, maybe we do an FBA to understand, WTF, what's the function. Safety plans, clear safety plans for targets, working closely with families and external agencies. I think all of those things synergize and come together to really help create a safer and a climate that is focused on belonging and positivity.
So while this may look different from building to building and district to district, when we consider the students that are most affected by bullying, are we really looking at this with a focus on fairness or just treating the symptoms? And we've touched based on restorative discipline. So when we approach discipline for instances of bullying, are we really approaching it that it's not just a punishment, but giving students the opportunity to think about what they did, to make things right, and to change their behaviors?
So look, being on the receiving end of someone who is bullying you is not good for anyone. There are effects, small and large, for anybody on the receiving end. What we do know, though, is that students with other risk factors like struggling with mental health issues, maybe having mental illness already, students who are not connected to us in a positive way, students who aren't connected to anybody in a positive way, those factors can start to compound, and it makes the effects of bullying look more and more significant. When we look at something like the PAYS data and we do something called cross-tabbing, where we ask students a question like, have you been bullied during the past 12 months? And it's a yes-no question. And then we look at the two groups, the students who say yes and the students who say no. We look at students who say no, and then we look at how they answer other questions like, well, you haven't been bullied in the past 12 months, but let's ask you the questions about whether you've been sad or hopeless. Let's ask whether you've been, seriously considered suicide, made a plan for suicide, attempted suicide. When we start separating out those two groups, what we see very clearly is that students who are being bullied have now a tremendous risk factor for whether they're starting to feel sad or hopeless, whether they're starting to even go further than that and consider suicide, make plans for suicide. And so we know that the students who are most affected by bullying, there can be some tipping points and additional factors that make it hard. So when I think about how do we discipline for this, bullying, or really quite frankly any kind of discipline, I always asked myself two questions, and I encourage leaders that I'm working with to ask two questions about what we're doing as far as discipline. And those two questions are, what are we trying to accomplish by this consequence that we are giving as a disciplinary consequence? What are we trying to accomplish? And then what are we actually going to accomplish by giving the particular consequence that we do? And we have to then sit down and say both good and bad. If we're trying to accomplish teaching a student a skill, having there be a little bit of time where everybody steps away from each other so we can take down the heat a little bit, that's the way to answer what are we trying to accomplish. But then when we get into the actually what will we accomplish, what we need to understand is, one, to really look at what are the negatives of any particular consequence. If we have to say, this is somebody who has repeatedly bullied, we've gone through our disciplinary procedures, we're the whole way up to maybe a suspension at this point, and we think about what are we actually going to accomplish. What we have in front of us is a student who is struggling, and we need to ask why they're struggling so much they feel like they have to engage in this act of aggression. And what will we do to support them too? Because them being on for a few days will not fix whatever is at the root cause of that. So when I think about discipline and who's being affected, it's not just the people on the receiving end. And when we engage then in the disciplining of this, we don't want to just think about, what we hope to accomplish, but what we actually will accomplish and what we should be accomplishing, really.
So we've examined some of the aspects of discipline, and also what happens when we have reports of bullying, whether it be from students or educators that are being reported, and nothing happens or nothing changes. So if we're being realistic, what does real accountability and follow through look like?
I think many times the reason people feel like nothing is being addressed is because our policies and procedures are not clearly spelled out to people of what they can expect, what they should expect if bullying is reported. And when we don't explain to people, if you report bullying, here's what's happening behind the scenes, including the fact that you may not be able to know everything that's happening. If we don't explicitly explain what's happening behind the scenes to everyone, from children to the adults in that school to families to community members, and people start filling in the blanks themselves and they say nothing's going on. And so when I really look at the root cause of why people feel like nothing's going on, it's because we haven't taken enough time to explain to them what actually is going on. To Susan's point, I haven't met an administrator yet who just says, I'm not going to address that at all, I don't care about that. There will always be some situation where people feel like it wasn't addressed as thoroughly as they would have addressed it. But I think explaining those systems of what's actually going on can help. And that's also what part of the follow through is going back and saying, I told you whenever a report of bullying is going on, we would be doing A, B, C, and D. And now that I'm following through with you, here are the things that have gone on that I can share with you.
I think that's crucial, because misinformation thrives in a vacuum. And if we're not consistently reminding people, this is what happened, this is what we're doing, this is what I can tell you, and here's what you can do, then I think the misinformation just runs wild.
So if we're focusing on prevention and really implementing strategies that have impact, what's one big change schools really need to make to finally put an end to this cycle?
Susan, do you have an answer for that question?
I do have an answer. And, it comes back to the theme of this whole podcast series, which is work on school climate. And when we work on school climate, we really are looking to make sure that everyone in that building feels seen and heard and understood. So, that's the best answer that I can give in this moment.
And I can't thank you two enough for the continued conversation. You've heard it today. Now's not the time to stay on autopilot. From rising concerns in the latest PAYS data to the subtle signals happening in the hallways and online spaces, the message is pretty clear. Bullying is still here, and it's changing. We've unpacked how deeper issues like student connection, adult relationships, and community pressures all intersect with bullying behavior. And we've asked some hard questions. Are we reacting or preventing? Are we naming it clearly or just calling it drama? And most importantly, are we building systems that promote real accountability, equity, and healing? So the work doesn't stop here. Whether you're a teacher, a principal, a school resource officer, or a counselor, we all play a role in creating safer, more connected schools. And if we're serious about ending the cycle, it's time to move beyond check-the-box policies and take a closer look at what's really happening and what we're willing to change. Thanks for turning in to Lesson Learned, the official podcast of the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Department in Midwestern Intermediate Unit 4. Until next time, continue to educate, innovate, and inspire. We'll see you soon.